When we think of ancient prophets, we usually picture these figures who just, unquestioningly deliver whatever message God gives them. But what happens when the prophet actually argues back? That's what we're diving into today, a really dramatic section from the book of Ezekiel that kicks off with a fascinating and pretty rare disagreement between the prophet and God himself. I mean, seriously, think about that question for a second. Why would a prophet argue with God over a metaphor? They're supposed to deliver the mail, not critique the handwriting, right? Well, that's exactly what happens here. And believe it or not, it's the key that unlocks this absolutely terrifying vision of divine judgment. So let's get into it. Our story starts with a message from God that's powerful, yeah, but maybe just a little too poetic. And it leads to this incredible moment where Ezekiel basically says, I need something clearer. Okay, so the first image God gives Ezekiel is this massive forest fire. And who's starting it? God. And we're not talking about a little campfire here. This thing is a monster blaze that's going to devour every single tree, green or dry. It's a picture of total, inescapable destruction. But this is where it gets so interesting. Ezekiel pushes back. He says, Lord God, which is a big deal for him. He's worried that the people he's preaching to are just going to roll their eyes and say, oh, here comes Ezekiel with another one of his confusing allegories. The whole warning would just go right over their heads. And here's the amazing part. God agrees with him. The message gets a total rewrite. The vague, poetic forest fire is swapped out for something brutally, unmistakably clear, a sword. There's no mistaking what that means. We've gone from poetry to the direct, terrifying language of military invasion. All right, so the metaphor gets an upgrade. Now let's dig into what this new symbol, the sword, really means, because its meaning is every bit as sharp as its blade. So the sword isn't just any old sword. It specifically represents the Babylonian army. And this is a huge theological point. God himself is wielding this foreign pagan empire as his personal instrument of judgment. And this isn't the first attack. This is the second one, the big one, the one that is going to be so much more destructive. And the scale of this thing is just staggering. It's aimed right at the heart of the nation, Jerusalem, its holy places, everything. The text even says it will cut off both righteous and wicked. Now that sounds shocking, right? But it's likely a rhetorical way of saying that this disaster will be so massive, so all-encompassing, that no one is going to escape its effects. You have to remember, prophecy in this time wasn't just about giving speeches. It was performance art. So God tells Ezekiel, I want you to go out in public and just moan and wail with a broken heart. He's supposed to physically act out the horror of his own message, to show people exactly how they should be feeling about the news that's coming. Okay, so this sets up a really fascinating strategic moment. The Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar, he's got a problem. A bunch of smaller nations have rebelled against him at the same time. So who does he deal with first? How does the sword pick its target? To get the answer, we have to talk about something called divination. This was the ancient practice of trying to figure out the future or get guidance from the gods using all sorts of rituals and omens. It's how kings made their biggest decisions. And the prophecy lays out the whole process. Nebuchadnezzar is standing at a literal fork in the road. One way goes to the Ammonites, the other way to Judah. So what does he do? He shakes arrows. He consults his little household idols. He inspects an animal's liver for signs. And here is the absolute kicker. The prophecy says this whole pagan ritual is the exact mechanism that God uses to point his sword right at Jerusalem. So the target is locked in. But why? Why does Jerusalem get picked? Why the severe final verdict? Well, this next part is basically the prosecution laying out its entire case against the city. So God puts Jerusalem on the witness stand, and the main charge is absolutely devastating. He calls it a city of bloodshed. That's not just about a single crime. It's about an entire culture of violence that has taken over. And the list of charges just keeps coming. It's this rapid-fire indictment of a society that has completely decayed. We're talking widespread violence, idol worship, disrespecting parents, extorting foreigners, taking advantage of orphans and widows, even using slander to get people killed. The whole social fabric has just come apart at the seams. Now, to explain how things got this bad, Ezekiel pulls out another allegory. And I gotta tell you, this one is intentionally shocking. It's a story about two sisters that details a very long and sordid history of spiritual and political unfaithfulness. Let's break it down. You've got the first sister, Ohala. She represents the northern kingdom of Israel, or Samaria. Her crime was chasing after unfaithful political alliances, or love affairs, as the allegory puts it, with Assyria. Then you have the second sister, Oholiba. That's Jerusalem. And her crime? She watched her older sister get destroyed for this behavior, and then went and did the exact same thing, making shady deals with Assyria, Babylon, and Egypt. She learned nothing. And this brings us to another famous prophetic metaphor, the cup of judgment. The idea is that Judah now has to drink from the same cup that her sister did. She's going to experience the exact same intoxicating, overwhelming, and totally devastating punishment that took down the northern kingdom years before. Okay, so we have the weapon, we have the motive, and now we come to the final act. The judgment is handed down. We're about to see what happens to Judah's king, and then the story takes one last, absolutely stunning turn. Well, the buck stops at the top. The prophecy points directly at King Zedekiah, the last king of Judah. The order is given. Take off his crown, strip him of his royal turban. His reign is over. And for the nation, the result is summed up in three powerful words: ruin, ruin, absolute ruin. And with that, it seems like the story is over. The sword of Babylon has done its terrible work. The judgment is complete. But then, the twist. Just when you think it's all wrapped up, God turns his attention to the sword itself, to Babylon. He tells the sword to return to its sheath. Its work is done. But then he says, "And in your own land, I will judge you." The very instrument of judgment is now going to be judged. And this idea is a huge theme throughout the prophets. It's not a one-off. The prophet Isaiah put it perfectly when he was talking about Assyria. He asks, "Shall the axe boast over the one who wields it?" The tool, whether it's Assyria or Babylon, can't get arrogant. It doesn't have the real power. The axe doesn't get to tell the lumberjack what to do. And that's what this whole epic prophecy leaves us with, this deep and timeless question. Whether you're talking about ancient empires or modern powers, it forces us to ask, at what point does a tool used for justice become so arrogant that it needs to face justice itself?